Sometimes the strongest walls we build are around our own hearts, and sometimes it takes a stranger's gentle hands to tear them down. Love has a way of finding us when we least expect it, in places we never thought to look. In 1880s Texas, Josephine Whitmore arrives in Bitter Creek to buy land for her father's railroad. A twisted ankle changes everything when Eli Thornfield, a giant cowboy who keeps to himself, carries her to safety. She's used to fancy dresses and proper manners. He's used to talking more to horses than people. What neither expects is how her heart will start racing every time his gentle hands touch her wounded ankle, or how his quiet strength will make her question everything she thought she wanted in life. But will love be enough to bridge a divide as wide as the Texas sky? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Bitter Creek, Texas, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and gold. Heat shimmers danced above the wooden boardwalks like restless spirits, and the air hung thick with the scent of sage, horse sweat, and the promise of another scorching day. This was frontier country in its truest form, raw, unforgiving, and beautiful in its harsh simplicity. The stagecoach that rumbled into town that Tuesday morning carried more than just mail and supplies. It carried Josephine Whitmore, and with her, the kind of refined elegance that made hardened cowboys stop their conversations mid-sentence and tip their hats with awkward reverence. She stepped down from the coach with practiced grace, her emerald silk traveling dress somehow managing to look pristine despite the long, dusty journey from San Antonio. Her auburn hair was pinned in an elaborate arrangement beneath a small feathered hat, and her pearl-handled mirror caught the sunlight as she checked her appearance with the unconscious habit of someone accustomed to being observed. At 26, Josephine had the kind of beauty that spoke of privilege and careful cultivation, smooth hands that had never known calluses, a complexion protected from sun and wind, posture that had been corrected by governesses since childhood. But there was something else in her green eyes, a restlessness that suggested depths beneath the polished surface. "Miss Whitmore?" The hotel proprietor, a nervous man named Henderson, hurried forward with his hat already in his hands. "We've prepared our finest room for you, just as your father's telegram requested." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." Her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern finishing schools, each word precisely enunciated. "I trust the surveying equipment has arrived?" "Yes, ma'am. Everything's waiting in your room, along with the maps of the territory your father wants inspected." Josephine nodded, though inwardly she felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a heavy shawl. Charles Whitmore, railroad magnate, and her demanding father, had finally decided to trust her with an important business matter. The land around Bitter Creek was prime for expansion, rolling hills, perfect for laying track, with water sources and timber nearby. Her job was simple: assess the terrain, negotiate with landowners, and report back with recommendations. What her father didn't know was how desperately she needed this assignment to mean something. At 26, she was considered practically a spinster by society's standards. Her father had been making increasingly pointed suggestions about suitable marriages to business associates, men who would bring useful connections to the Whitmore empire. The thought made her stomach tighten with a familiar dread. As Henderson led her into the modest hotel, Josephine caught fragments of conversation from the men lounging on the front porch. "That's the railroad heiress. Pretty as a china doll, ain't she? Wonder what brings her way out here, nothing but dust and cattle for miles." She kept her expression serene, though she had heard similar whispers all her life. To most people, she was nothing more than Charles Whitmore's daughter, a decorative extension of his wealth and power. The idea that she might have her own thoughts, ambitions, or capabilities seemed to escape them entirely. Her room was clean but Spartan, a far cry from the luxury she was accustomed to. The surveying equipment sat neatly arranged on the small table: compass, measuring chains, notebooks, and detailed territorial maps marked with her father's precise handwriting. She traced the boundaries with her finger, noting the various property owners and landmarks. One name appeared frequently on the maps, but without the detailed notes that accompanied the others: E. Thornfield. His property seemed to border several key areas, but there were no purchase offers recorded, no negotiations attempted, just a name and boundaries marked in fading ink. After settling in and changing into a more practical brown riding dress, Josephine decided to begin her survey immediately. The sooner she completed this assignment successfully, the sooner she could prove to her father that she was capable of more than hosting dinner parties and managing household staff. The livery stable owner, a weathered man named Pete, eyed her skeptically when she requested a horse. "Begging your pardon, miss, but are you sure you want to ride out alone? Country's rough, and there's talk of storms coming in." "I'm quite capable of handling myself, thank you." Josephine's tone was polite but firm. She had been riding since childhood, and despite what these men might think, she was perfectly competent to manage a survey expedition. Pete shrugged and saddled a gentle mare named Rosie. "Suit yourself, but I'd avoid the northern territories if I were you. That's where old Thornfield keeps his spread, and he don't take kindly to strangers. Mr. Thornfield, big fellow, keeps to himself mostly. Lives way out on the edge of nowhere with just his horses for company. Folks say he used to be different, more sociable-like, but that was before." Pete stopped himself and shook his head. "Anyway, he don't much care for visitors." Josephine filed this information away as she mounted Rosie. The mysterious E. Thornfield was beginning to intrigue her, and his property appeared to be strategically important for the railroad's plans. Perhaps it was time someone made a proper effort to approach him about selling. The ride out of town was pleasant at first. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, covered in hardy grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in brilliant splashes of color: Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and golden coreopsis that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Josephine found herself breathing deeper than she had in months. There was something about this vast openness that made her feel simultaneously smaller and larger than herself. In Boston's drawing rooms, she felt constantly observed and judged. Here, under the endless sky, she felt free. She had been riding for nearly 2 hours, making notes and sketching landmarks, when she decided to investigate a particularly promising valley that appeared to offer an ideal route for railroad tracks. According to her maps, this was the edge of Thornfield's property. The path down into the valley was steeper than it appeared, and Rosie began picking her way carefully between loose rocks and scrub brush. Josephine was so focused on maintaining her seat and studying the terrain that she didn't notice the rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a boulder until Rosie did. The mare reared with a terrified whinny, and Josephine, caught off guard, felt herself sliding sideways from the saddle. She had a brief, dizzy moment of panic before hitting the rocky ground hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sharp crack that made her cry out. Pain shot up her leg like lightning, and for a moment she could only lie there, breathing hard and fighting back tears. Rosie had bolted, probably heading back toward town, leaving Josephine alone in the growing heat with what felt like a seriously injured ankle. She tried to stand and immediately sat back down, gasping. The pain was excruciating, and her ankle was already beginning to swell. She was at least 5 miles from town, with no horse and no way to summon help. That was when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, steady, measured, coming from the direction of the valley floor. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by embarrassment, so much for proving her competence. The rider who appeared around the bend was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been born in the saddle, but it was his sheer size that made her breath catch. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His face was weathered and serious, framed by dark hair that touched his collar, and his eyes were the color of winter storms. He dismounted and approached her with careful, measured steps, like someone accustomed to dealing with frightened animals. When he spoke, his voice was low and gentle, with the faint hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Ma'am, you hurt?" Josephine tried to maintain her dignity, despite sitting in the dirt, with her hair coming loose from its pins. "I've injured my ankle. My horse was startled by a snake." He nodded, as if this explained everything, then knelt beside her with surprising grace for such a large man. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated. In her world, such intimate contact between strangers was absolutely scandalous. But her ankle was throbbing, and she was stranded miles from help. "I suppose that would be wise." His hands were massive, but surprisingly gentle, as he examined her ankle through her boot. She noticed they were clean despite his work-worn appearance, and his touch was clinical, professional, like someone with medical experience. "Not broken," he said after a moment, "but twisted pretty bad. You won't be walking on it today." "I see." Josephine's mind raced through her limited options, none of them pleasant. "I don't suppose you could help me back to town?" Instead of answering immediately, he seemed to study her with those storm-grey eyes. She had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than her refined appearance and obvious helplessness. "My place is closer," he said finally. "Get you cleaned up, ankle wrapped proper. Send word to town if you like." It was on the tip of her tongue to refuse to insist on returning to the hotel despite the distance and her injury. Everything about this situation violated every rule of proper behavior she had ever been taught. But something in his quiet manner, his careful way of not crowding her or making her feel trapped, made her reconsider. "You're Mr. Thornfield, aren't you?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Eli Thornfield." "Yes, ma'am." "You know me?" "Only by reputation. I'm Josephine Whitmore." She watched for recognition, for the change in demeanor that usually accompanied the mention of her father's name and wealth. But Eli Thornfield's expression remained steady and unimpressed. "Well, Miss Whitmore, we best get you somewhere more comfortable before that ankle swells any worse." Without waiting for further discussion, he stood and moved toward his horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed as large and powerful as its rider. The animal stood perfectly still as Eli retrieved what appeared to be a folded blanket from his saddlebags. "This might not be proper," he said, approaching her again, "but it's practical. I'm going to carry you." Before she could protest, he had wrapped the blanket around her and lifted her as easily as if she weighed no more than a child. She found herself cradled against his chest, acutely aware of his strength and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He smelled of leather and sage, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel strangely lightheaded. "My equipment," she managed to say. "I had surveying instruments. I'll come back for them," he said simply, settling her carefully in front of him on the saddle. His arms encircled her securely as he took up the reins, and she felt safer than she had any right to feel in such an unconventional situation. As they rode toward his homestead, Josephine found herself stealing glances at his profile. There was something almost noble about his features, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the way he sat his horse with unconscious dignity. This was not the rough frontiersman she had expected based on the townspeople's whispered descriptions. Who exactly was Eli Thornfield, and why did she have the feeling that meeting him was going to change everything? Eli's cabin sat in a small valley sheltered by cottonwood trees, and Josephine's first glimpse of it challenged every assumption she had formed about the mysterious rancher. The structure was modest but well built, with clean lines and careful craftsmanship evident in every board and beam. A small garden flourished beside the front porch, and the barn beyond looked sturdy and well-maintained. "This isn't what I expected," she said as he helped her down from the horse. "What did you expect?" His tone held no defensiveness, only mild curiosity. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure. Something more primitive, I suppose." "Disappointing. Quite the opposite." He carried her up the front steps and through the door, and Josephine found herself in a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room. Everything was clean and orderly, with handmade furniture that showed both skill and artistic sensibility. But what truly caught her attention were the sketches covering one wall, dozens of them, all of horses in various poses, drawn with a delicate precision that spoke of real talent. "You drew these?" she asked, as he settled her carefully into a chair near the fireplace. "Helps pass the time." He moved to a cabinet and retrieved what appeared to be medical supplies, clean cloths, a bottle of liniment, strips of fabric for bandaging. "Need to get that boot off and see how bad the swelling is." Josephine hesitated. The intimacy of the situation was unprecedented in her sheltered life, but the throbbing in her ankle was growing worse by the minute. "I should mention," she said as he knelt beside her chair, "I'm not accustomed to that in my circle, this sort of—" "Miss Whitmore," he interrupted gently, beginning to unlace her boot with careful precision. "I've doctored horses, cattle, and people for more years than I care to count. Right now, you're just someone who needs help." His matter-of-fact tone somehow made the situation less awkward. As he eased her boot off, she couldn't help but notice how his large hands moved with surprising delicacy. The ankle was indeed swollen and already showing signs of bruising. "Could be worse," he said, gently probing the injury. "But you'll be staying off it for a few days at least." "A few days?" Josephine's voice rose in alarm. "That's impossible. I have work to complete, reports to file." "Work won't matter much if you damage this ankle permanently." He began applying cool cloths to reduce the swelling. Sometimes the body has its own timeline. As he worked, Josephine found herself studying his face. There was something almost meditative about his concentration, and she noticed details that had escaped her earlier. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the sun, the small scar along his jaw, the way his mouth curved slightly when he was focused on a task. "Where did you learn medical treatment?" she asked. "Here and there." He wrapped her ankle with expert precision. "You pick things up when you're far from town doctors." She sensed there was more to the story, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't inclined to elaborate. Instead, she found herself looking around the cabin with growing curiosity. A leather journal lay open on the table near the window, its pages covered with what appeared to be more sketches and brief notations in a neat, educated hand. "You're not what I expected either, Mr. Thornfield." He glanced up from his work. "How so?" "The townspeople made you sound like—" She paused, searching for tactful words. "Like a hermit? A wild man?" His mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "I suppose that's fair enough. I don't socialize much." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. He finished wrapping her ankle and sat back on his heels, those storm-grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Sometimes it's easier to keep to yourself," he said finally. "Less complicated." Before she could pursue that cryptic response, he stood and moved to the stove. "You'll be wanting some food." "It's been a long day." As he prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Josephine found herself relaxing despite the unusual circumstances. There was something soothing about watching him move around the small kitchen with quiet efficiency. He wasted no motion, spoke no unnecessary words, but there was a grace to his actions that suggested careful thought behind every gesture. The food was simple but well prepared, and they ate in comfortable silence as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. It wasn't until they had finished that Josephine remembered her obligations. "I should send word to town," she said. "They'll be expecting me back, and my father will be concerned if he doesn't receive reports." Eli nodded and retrieved paper and ink from a shelf. "I'll ride in tomorrow morning, deliver any messages you want to send." She wrote quickly, explaining her accident and delayed return in terms that would satisfy her father's business concerns without revealing the scandalous nature of her current situation. As she sealed the letter, she noticed Eli watching her write with obvious interest. "You're surprised I can write?" she asked. "Surprised by how you write. Most folks around here form their letters different." She looked down at her precise, educated script, the product of years with expensive tutors and finishing school instructors. "I suppose I had advantages not everyone enjoys." "That's not what I meant." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Education's fine, but there's something about the way you hold yourself, the way you speak, like you're always performing for an audience." The observation stung because it was accurate, perhaps because I usually am. Must be exhausting. The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had seen past her carefully maintained facade to recognize the effort it required? When had anyone cared whether maintaining her role in society's elaborate performance was tiring? "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. As evening approached, the practical realities of the situation became unavoidable. She couldn't walk, couldn't ride, and propriety demanded she return to town as soon as possible. Yet her ankle throbbed with every movement, and the thought of attempting the journey back to Bitter Creek made her feel faint. "I have a proposition," Eli said as if reading her thoughts. "You need time for that ankle to heal properly. I need help with the land survey. I've got property disputes that require proper documentation. You're offering me work." "I'm offering practical arrangement. You get time to heal and complete your business. I get professional survey of my property lines. We both benefit." "Continue." Josephine considered this. Her father's telegram had given her considerable latitude in how she conducted the survey, and staying would allow her to complete a thorough job. More importantly, something about this quiet man and his peaceful valley made her reluctant to leave. "The townspeople will talk," she said. "They already are." His tone was pragmatic rather than concerned. "Question is whether you let their talk dictate your choices." As darkness fell and Eli lit the oil lamps, Josephine found herself in the most unconventional situation of her life. She was staying overnight in a bachelor's cabin, unchaperoned and injured, with a man she had met only hours earlier. By every rule of proper society, her reputation was already compromised beyond repair. Yet she felt safer and more at peace than she had in months. "There's a cot in the back room," Eli said, banking the fire for the night. "Clean blankets, privacy. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "Mr. Thornfield, Eli, I want you to know this isn't I don't usually." "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "sometimes circumstances choose for us. All we can do is make the best of them with honor and kindness." As she settled into the small back room, listening to the sounds of him preparing his makeshift bed in the main room, Josephine reflected on the day's events. This morning she had been Charles Whitmore's dutiful daughter, following his instructions and maintaining her carefully constructed image. Tonight she was lying in a stranger's cabin, her ankle wrapped by his gentle hands, her assumptions about life challenged by his quiet wisdom. She reached for the small mirror from her traveling bag, studying her reflection in the lamplight. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her face flushed from sun and wind, her dress wrinkled from the day's adventures. She looked different, less polished, perhaps, but somehow more real. Outside, she could hear the soft sounds of Eli moving around the cabin, the crackle of the dying fire, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow's obligations or expectations. She had no way of knowing that this single day had set in motion events that would transform not just her mission, but her entire understanding of what it meant to truly live. Josephine woke to the aroma of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through the small window of the back room. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, memory returned the accident, Eli's unexpected kindness, her decision to stay and recover. She tested her ankle gingerly and found the swelling had decreased, though it still ached when she put weight on it. Moving carefully, she made her way to the main room, where she found Eli standing at the stove, already fully dressed and apparently having been up for hours. "Morning," he said without turning around. How's the ankle? Better, thank you. She felt suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance, her hair loose and her dress wrinkled from sleep. In her world, ladies were never seen in such a state, but Eli seemed entirely unconcerned with her lack of proper grooming. He handed her a cup of coffee and a plate of food, then settled into the chair across from her with his own breakfast. They ate in comfortable silence, and Josephine found herself stealing glances at him in the morning light. There was something peaceful about his presence, an absence of the constant social tension she was accustomed to navigating. "I'll head into town this morning," he said as they finished eating. "Deliver your letter, bring back your surveying equipment. Anything else you need, perhaps some additional clothes? I hadn't planned for an extended stay." He nodded, then hesitated as if debating whether to speak. "The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Patterson, she's a kind woman. I'll ask her to select appropriate things for you." After he left, Josephine found herself alone in the cabin for the first time. She moved carefully around the space, examining the details she had missed the night before. The furniture was all handmade, but showed remarkable craftsmanship, smooth joints, elegant proportions, careful attention to both function and beauty. It was while examining a particularly well-crafted bookshelf that she discovered a small wooden horse, no larger than her palm, tucked behind a row of books. The carving was exquisite, capturing not just the animal's form, but somehow its spirit, the arch of neck, the flow of mane, the sense of barely contained power. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the detail work. "You found Thunder?" She turned, startled. Eli had returned without her hearing his approach. "Thunder?" That's what she called him. His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught something underneath an old pain, carefully controlled. "She." Eli moved to stoke the fire, his back to her. "Little girl I knew once. Asked me to carve her a horse to match her daddy's stallion." Josephine waited, sensing there was more to the story. "Fever took her and her parents 3 winters back," he said finally. "Whole family gone, in less than a week." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Josephine felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry. She was going to be 6 come spring." He turned back to face her, and she saw the careful walls he kept around that old pain. Always meant to finish painting him like she wanted. But, he shrugged, leaving the sentence incomplete. "You knew them well?" "Tom and Sarah were good neighbors. Katie was." He paused, seeming to search for words. "She had a way of seeing the world that made everything seem brighter. Used to come by here regular, chattering about her horses and her grand plans for when she grew up." Josephine held the small carving carefully, understanding now why it had been hidden away. "This is beautiful work. She would have loved it." Eli moved to retrieve something from his saddlebags. "Got your equipment back. Mrs. Patterson sent some things for you as well." As he set out her surveying instruments and a small bundle of women's clothing, Josephine found herself watching him with new understanding. The isolation, the careful distance he maintained from others, it wasn't antisocial behavior, but self-protection. He had loved and lost, and the wound was still tender. "Eli," she said gently, "would you like to tell me about your neighbors? About Katie?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then he settled into his chair, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, and began to speak. He told her about Tom Morrison, a struggling homesteader with big dreams and a generous heart. About Sarah, who made the best apple pie in 3 counties and never met a stray animal she wouldn't feed. And about Katie, bright and fearless, who had appointed herself Eli's unofficial helper with the horses and had 1,000 questions about everything from cloud formations to why horses slept standing up. "She was teaching me to see things different," he said. "How a sunset could be a painting, how horses had personalities just like people. Made me realize I'd been living without really looking at the world around me. What happened to their place? Bank took it. No family left to claim it, and the debt followed them to the grave." His jaw tightened slightly. "Good land. just needed someone who understood farming better than Tom did. Josephine found herself thinking about her father's business practices, the way he acquired properties from families who couldn't make their payments. She had never considered the human cost of such transactions, the dreams destroyed, the lives disrupted. You tried to help them? Did what I could. But I'm better with horses than crops, and pride's a powerful thing. Tom wouldn't take what he called charity. They sat in silence for a while, and Josephine found herself studying Eli's profile as he stared into the fire. There was so much more to this man than the taciturn hermit the townspeople described. He had depth, compassion, an artist's eye for beauty, and the kind of loyalty that endured beyond death. "Why do you stay out here alone?" she asked finally. He looked at her, those storm-grey eyes serious. "Easier to keep people at a distance than to risk losing them again." The honesty of his answer took her breath away. In her world, people rarely spoke such truths aloud. Conversations were layered with social niceties, hidden meanings, careful maneuvering around real feelings. "That must be lonely." "Loneliness is better than grief," he said simply. Josephine thought about her own life, surrounded by people who knew her name and social position, but not her hopes or fears. She had been lonely in crowded ballrooms, isolated despite constant company. "I'm not sure I agree," she said. "I think perhaps both can be equally painful." He studied her with new attention. "You speak like someone who knows. Different kind of isolation, perhaps, but isolation nonetheless." As the afternoon wore on, Eli began teaching her about his land, the water sources, the natural boundaries, the challenges of raising horses in such terrain. She found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that went beyond her surveying requirements. When he brought out his journal to show her detailed maps he had drawn of the property, she was struck again by his artistic ability. The sketches were not just functional but beautiful, capturing the character of the land with the same sensitivity he brought to his horse portraits. "You have real talent," she said, tracing one of his drawings with her finger. "Just something to do with my hands." "No, it's more than that. You see things the way light falls, the way animals move. That's not common." He seemed uncomfortable with the praise, changing the subject back to the survey work. But Josephine had seen the flash of pleasure in his eyes, and she realized that perhaps no one had ever acknowledged his artistic gifts before. As evening approached, and they shared another simple meal, she found herself reluctant to see the day end. Tomorrow she would begin the actual survey work, establishing the professional distance appropriate to their arrangement. Tonight, she was simply a woman getting to know a remarkable man, and she was surprised by how much she was enjoying the experience. She was also surprised by how natural it felt to laugh at his dry observations about ranch life, to share her own stories about the absurdities of high society, to sit in comfortable silence when conversation wasn't needed. For the first time in her adult life, she was being seen and accepted exactly as she was, not as Charles Whitmore's daughter or a potential business asset, but simply as herself. It was both liberating and terrifying. As she prepared for bed in the small back room, Josephine found herself hoping her ankle would need a few more days to heal properly. She wasn't ready to return to her old life just yet. The third morning brought with it a sense of routine that Josephine found surprisingly pleasant. Her ankle was healing well enough to allow her to move around the cabin with minimal discomfort, and she had begun to feel less like an invalid and more like a temporary resident. It also brought the first telegraph from her father. Eli returned from town with her requested supplies and a yellow envelope that made Josephine's stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Charles Whitmore's messages were never social pleasantries. "Josephine, stop, expected preliminary report by now. Stop, explain, delay, stop, father." She stared at the terse message, feeling the weight of expectation and impatience in every word. 3 days had passed since her accident, 3 days during which she should have been making significant progress on the land assessment. "Bad news?" Eli asked, noting her expression. "My father is not a patient man." She folded the telegram and tucked it into her pocket. He expects regular reports, and I have little to show for my time here. Healing takes time. He won't see it that way. She moved to the window, looking out at the rolling hills that had begun to feel like sanctuary. Charles Whitmore views delays as inefficiency, and inefficiency as failure. Eli joined her at the window, his presence solid and comforting. What does he expect from you? Success, always success, perfect execution of his plans, flawless representation of the family name. She surprised herself by speaking so candidly. I'm his only child, you see. His heir, his legacy, but also his greatest disappointment. How so? I should have been a son. The admission came out more bitter than she intended. A son would have been groomed for business from childhood, prepared to take over the empire. A daughter is useful only for strategic marriages and social connections. That's why you're out here doing survey work. Josephine nodded. My chance to prove I can be useful in business matters. If I succeed, perhaps he'll trust me with more responsibility. If I fail. She shrugged, not wanting to voice her fears about her father's increasingly pointed suggestions regarding suitable husbands. What happens if you don't report back soon? He'll send someone to check on me, probably Arthur Dennison, his business manager. Arthur has been attentive lately, and I suspect my father sees advantages in a union between his daughter and his most trusted employee. Something shifted in Eli's expression. Attentive? How? Flowers, invitations to dinner, gifts, all very proper and calculated. She turned away from the window. Arthur is intelligent, well-connected, financially sound. By every practical measure, he would be an excellent husband. But the single word hung in the air, and Josephine found herself struggling to articulate feelings she had barely acknowledged to herself. But when he touches my hand, I feel nothing. When he speaks, I find myself thinking about other things. When he looks at me, I feel like he's assessing a business asset rather than seeing a woman. She glanced at Eli and caught something in his expression that made her heart skip. Then he turned away, busying himself with unnecessary tasks around the cabin. We should start the survey work, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Show your father you're making progress. The next few hours were spent in professional collaboration. Eli proved to be an excellent assistant, understanding the surveying equipment intuitively and offering insights about the land that would have taken her days to discover on her own. His property was more extensive than she had realized, encompassing several prime locations for railroad development. But it was impossible to maintain purely professional distance when working so closely together. Their hands brushed when they shared equipment. She caught him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When he helped her over rough terrain, his touch was gentle but lingering. Tell me about your horses, she said during a rest break, partly to distract herself from his proximity. His face lit up in a way she had never seen before. What do you want to know? Everything. How you choose them, train them, what makes each one special. For the next hour he talked about his animals with the passion of a true horseman. He described their individual personalities, their quirks and talents, the careful process of earning their trust and developing their potential. His knowledge was encyclopedic, but it was his obvious love for the creatures that touched her most deeply. You should see Midnight Run, he said, his eyes distant with memory. Black as his name suggests, but when he moves, it's like watching poetry. Could I meet them? Properly meet them. Eli's smile was answer enough. The barn was a testament to his care and craftsmanship. Each stall was spacious and immaculately maintained, and the horses themselves were magnificent, well-fed, well-groomed, and clearly well-loved. As Eli introduced her to each animal, Josephine found herself seeing another side of his character. With the horses, he was patient, gentle, completely at ease. He spoke to them in low, soothing tones, and they responded to him with obvious affection and respect. Watching him work with a skittish young mare, Josephine understood that this was where his true talents lay, not just in understanding horses, but in communicating with them. "She's beautiful," Josephine said as the mare finally accepted her touch. "Rescued her from a man who thought breaking horses meant breaking their spirits," Eli said, his jaw tightening. "Took months to convince her that not all humans meant harm. You have a gift." "They teach me more than I teach them," he stroked the mare's neck. "Horses don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. They respond to truth, to genuine intention." The implication wasn't lost on her. In her world, genuine intention was a luxury few could afford. As they worked together through the afternoon, Josephine found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Eli. They communicated with gestures and glances as much as words, anticipating each other's needs in the surveying work. When she struggled with a particularly stubborn measurement, he was there to assist without being asked. When he needed a different tool, she had it ready before he requested it. It was the kind of partnership she had never experienced, based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing understanding, rather than social obligation or family pressure. That evening brought another telegram from her father, more demanding than the first. "Dennison departing tomorrow to assess situation. Stop. Expect full explanation. Stop. Complete work immediately. Stop, father." Josephine stared at the message with growing dread. Arthur Dennison's arrival would complicate everything. He would take one look at her unconventional living situation and report back to her father with recommendations that would end her independence permanently. "More bad news?" Eli asked gently. "My father is sending his business manager to check on me. Arthur will be here tomorrow or the next day." "The attentive one?" "The very same." She sank into her chair, feeling the walls of her old life closing in around her. "He'll insist I return to Boston immediately. My father will be furious about the impropriety of staying here, and any chance I had of proving myself capable will be lost." Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What if you weren't here when he arrived?" "What do you mean?" "We could take the survey work to the far boundaries of the property, camp out for a few days, complete the assessment of the Northern Territories. By the time we returned, he might have given up and gone back to report you were working diligently." The suggestion was scandalous, impractical, and utterly appealing. Several days alone with Eli in the wilderness, away from social constraints and family expectations. It was everything she shouldn't want, and everything she found herself craving. That would be improper. His eyes met hers, and she saw understanding there. Sometimes the proper thing and the right thing aren't the same. As she prepared for sleep that night, Josephine found herself facing a choice that would define not just her immediate future, but possibly her entire life. She could return to town tomorrow, meet Arthur Dennison, and submit to whatever arrangements her father had made for her future. Or she could take Eli's suggestion and spend a few more days discovering what it meant to live authentically, even if it meant risking everything she had been raised to value. The decision, she realized, was whether she was brave enough to choose her own path for the first time in her life. Dawn came with Josephine's decision already made. She found Eli in the barn, preparing his horses for the day's work, and announced quietly, "I'd like to survey the northern boundaries." He looked up from adjusting a saddle, and she saw relief in his expression. "It's rough country up there. You sure you're ready for that kind of riding?" "My ankle is much better, and I think," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think I need to see all of your land before I can make proper recommendations." What she didn't say was that she needed these few days to understand what she was walking away from when Arthur Dennison inevitably arrived to escort her back to Boston. They packed supplies for 3 days, including her surveying equipment and camping gear. As Eli helped her mount the gentle mare he had chosen for her, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and she felt that now familiar flutter of awareness. "You remember how to handle her?" he asked. "I remember." What she also remembered was how it felt to be carried in his arms, the strength and gentleness of his touch, the way her heart had raced when he looked at her with those storm-grey eyes. The ride north took them through some of the most beautiful country Josephine had ever seen. Rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain, with granite outcroppings and stands of ancient oak that provided welcome shade. Wild flowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant displays of color, and hawks circled lazily overhead in the clear blue sky. But it was Eli himself who commanded most of her attention. Away from the cabin, riding through the land he clearly loved, he seemed to come alive in ways she hadn't seen before. He pointed out landmarks, shared stories about the history of various locations, and demonstrated an intimate knowledge of every creek, every trail, every seasonal change the land experienced. "There's a story behind that rock formation," he said, indicating a strange cluster of boulders ahead. "Local tribes called it the Sleeping Bear. Tell me." So he did, recounting a legend about a great bear who had sacrificed himself to save his cubs during a terrible winter, and whose spirit still watched over the valley. Eli told the story with respect and obvious familiarity, and Josephine realized he had taken the time to learn the history of the land from its original inhabitants. "You know a great deal about this place," she observed. "A man should understand his home. Is that what this is to you? Home?" He was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a fallen log. "Took me a while to think of it that way. Used to be just the place I ended up after." He stopped himself. "After what?" Another silence, longer this time. Then, "After I lost my family." Josephine felt her breath catch. "You were married?" "Rachel." His voice was soft with old pain. "And we had a son, Benjamin. He would have been 8 this summer." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. She had assumed his isolation was preference, perhaps the result of losing neighbors and friends. But this was grief on an entirely different scale. "What happened?" "Fever, same as took the Morrison family, but that was back in Kansas, before I came here." He urged his horse forward. "Lost them both within days of each other." "Eli, don't." His voice was gentle but firm. "Don't offer condolences or try to make it better. It is what it is." They rode in silence for a while, and Josephine found herself understanding so much more about the man beside her. His careful distance from others, his reluctance to form attachments, his protective solitude, it all made sense now. He wasn't antisocial. He was terrified of loving and losing again. When they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek, Eli pulled a worn photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it to her without explanation. The image showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven and smiling, with his arms around a petite woman with kind eyes and a small boy who had inherited his father's strong jaw and serious expression. They looked happy, complete, like a family that had never known sorrow. "They're beautiful," Josephine said softly. "Rachel wanted to come west. Said it would be an adventure, a chance for Benjamin to grow up with room to run and explore." His laugh was bitter. "Adventure. We lasted 6 months before the fever came through our settlement. Is that when you came to Texas?" "Couldn't stay there. Everything reminded me of them. So I packed up, drifted south, ended up here." He took the photograph back, handling it with infinite care. "Meant to keep moving, but something about this valley," he shrugged. "Seemed like a good place to stop running." Josephine watched him tuck the photograph away, understanding now why he had been so affected by losing the Morrison family. Katie had probably reminded him of his son, Tom, and Sarah, of the family life he had lost. "Do you think Rachel would have liked it here?" He looked surprised by the question. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you've made something beautiful here. Your home, your horses, the way you care for the land. I think she would have been proud." For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and she saw the deep well of grief he carried. Then he turned away, busying himself with the horses. "We should move on. Want to reach the high pasture before afternoon." The high pasture when they reached it, took Josephine's breath away. A vast meadow stretched before them, surrounded by hills and filled with wildflowers. A small stream meandered through the grass, and the view stretched for miles in every direction. "This is spectacular," she breathed. "Best grazing land in 3 counties," Eli said with obvious pride. "Water year-round, protected from the worst weather, perfect for horses." As they set up camp in a grove of trees near the stream, Josephine found herself thinking about the railroad survey that had brought her here. This land would be invaluable for her father's expansion plans, perfect terrain for laying track, abundant water, strategic location. By all rights, she should be calculating its worth in dollars and documenting its potential for development. Instead, she found herself imagining it as Eli saw it, not as a commodity to be exploited, but as a living system to be preserved and protected. "Penny for your thoughts," Eli said as they prepared a simple dinner over their campfire. "I was thinking about perspective," she said carefully. "How the same piece of land can mean completely different things to different people. Your father sees railroad routes, and you see home for your horses. And you—" His eyes met hers across the firelight. "What do you see?" The question was more loaded than it appeared, and they both knew it. What did she see when she looked at this land? More importantly, what did she see when she looked at the man who had shown it to her? "I see peace," she said finally. "I see a place where someone could build a real life, not just an image of one." Something flickered in his expression, hope, perhaps, or recognition. Then the moment passed, and he turned his attention back to the fire. "Real life's harder than it looks from the outside," he said quietly. "Is it? Or is it just different from what we're taught to expect?" He studied her in the firelight, and she saw him weighing her words against her background, her upbringing, everything she represented. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you in that fancy dress," he admitted. "What did you expect?" Someone who would be counting the minutes until she could get back to civilization. Someone who would see all this, he gestured at the wilderness around them, as primitive and uncomfortable. And instead, you ask questions, real questions. You pay attention, you see things. He paused. "You're not performing out here." The observation was so accurate it made her chest tighten. Perhaps because there's no audience to perform for. "Is that what your life is like? Constant performance?" Josephine considered how to explain the suffocating weight of social expectations, the endless need to maintain appearances, the way every word and gesture was evaluated for its appropriateness and strategic value. "Imagine never being able to simply exist," she said finally. "Every conversation is a negotiation, every social interaction a test. You learn to present the version of yourself that others expect to see, until sometimes you forget what the real version looks like. That's why you're not married yet. Hard to find someone who wants the real person instead of the performance?" The question hit closer to home than she was comfortable admitting. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I've never met anyone who made me want to stop performing." Their eyes met across the fire, and the weight of unspoken possibilities hung between them. Josephine felt her heart racing, aware that they were approaching dangerous territory. In a few days, Arthur Dennison would arrive to take her back to Boston, back to her father's plans and expectations. This interlude, whatever it was becoming, had no future. But sitting by the campfire under a canopy of stars, with Eli's steady presence across from her, she found it hard to care about future consequences. "Tell me about your dreams," she said impulsively. "Before you lost them, what did you want your life to become?" Eli was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with old longing. "Rachel and I used to talk about having a place like this. Room for horses, for children to grow up free and strong. We dreamed about building something that would last, something we could pass down." He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "Simple dreams, I suppose. Not simple. Beautiful. What about you? What do you dream about when you're not busy being Charles Whitmore's daughter? The question caught her off guard. When had anyone ever asked what she wanted, rather than what was expected of her? I used to dream about traveling, she said slowly, seeing places where no one knew my name or my father's business. I imagined what it would be like to make decisions based on my own desires rather than family obligations. Used to? It seemed pointless to dream about impossible things. What makes them impossible? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything. My position, my responsibilities, my father's expectations. Women like me don't get to choose their own paths. Maybe women like you haven't tried hard enough. The challenge in his voice made her look at him sharply. You think it's simply a matter of trying? I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. I've watched you these past few days, the way you adapted to circumstances, learned new skills, asked real questions instead of polite ones. That takes courage. Courage? She shook her head. Courage would be standing up to my father, refusing the marriage he's arranging, choosing my own future. This is just postponing the inevitable, or practicing for when the time comes to make those harder choices. His words stayed with her as they prepared for sleep under the stars. As she lay in her bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness and Eli's steady breathing nearby, Josephine found herself imagining a different life, one where courage was possible, where dreams weren't luxuries she couldn't afford. For the first time in years, she fell asleep, not worrying about tomorrow's obligations, but wondering what it would feel like to wake up every morning in a place like this, beside a man who saw and valued the real woman beneath the social facade. The second morning in the high pasture dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that spoke of autumn's approach. Josephine woke to find Eli already up, tending the horses and preparing coffee over the rekindled fire. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple routine, so different from the elaborate morning rituals she was accustomed to in Boston. "Sleep well?" he asked as she joined him by the fire. "Better than I have in months." It was true, despite sleeping on the hard ground, she felt more rested than she had in her comfortable Boston bedroom in recent memory. As they shared breakfast and planned the day's surveying work, Josephine found herself studying Eli's profile in the morning light. The strong jaw, the gentle way he handled even the smallest tasks, the quiet competence that marked everything he did. She was becoming dangerously attached to this man and this life, and the knowledge filled her with both joy and dread. It was while they were working on measuring the eastern boundary that she noticed him pulling something from his pocket and looking at it with obvious discomfort. When he thought she wasn't watching, he slipped it back without explanation. "What was that?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then pulled out what appeared to be a small velvet box. "Something I should have gotten rid of long ago." With careful hands, he opened it to reveal a delicate ring, a simple gold band set with a modest but beautiful diamond. Even from a distance, Josephine could see it was exquisite in its understated elegance. "Rachel's engagement ring?" "No." His voice was tight. "This was going to be yours." The world seemed to stop. "Mine? If things were different, if I were a different man, with different circumstances." He closed the box with a sharp snap. Foolish notion. Josephine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Eli, don't." He turned away, shoving the box back into his pocket. "I had no right to even think about it. You're Charles Whitmore's daughter, promised to a successful businessman. I'm a widowed horse rancher with nothing to offer, but stop." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Stop deciding what I want or don't want based on assumptions about who I'm supposed to be." He looked at her then, and she saw pain and longing warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" Instead of answering immediately, Josephine reached into her own pocket and pulled out something she had been carrying since leaving Boston, her own engagement ring, the one her father had given her to wear when Arthur Dennison made his formal proposal. The ring she had quietly removed that first evening in Eli's cabin and had been unable to put back on since. "I've been engaged for 3 months," she said quietly. "Arthur proposed at a dinner party my father arranged, with 24 witnesses and a photographer to capture the moment for the society pages. Very romantic, very public, very binding." Eli's face went white. "You're engaged?" "Technically, yes, but I never said yes, Eli. I never agreed to marry him. My father announced the engagement. Arthur placed this ring on my finger, and everyone simply assumed I was delighted with the arrangement. But you wore the ring." "I wore the ring because refusing would have meant a public scandal that would have ruined my father's business relationships and destroyed my family's reputation." She held up the modest diamond, studying it in the sunlight. "But I never promised to marry him, and I never will. Josephine, when I put this ring on my finger, I felt nothing but dread. When I look at you, when you touch my hand, when you carry me in your arms." She stopped, realizing how much she was revealing. "I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Finally, Eli stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "You don't know what you're saying. The life you're used to, the security, the position, the loneliness," she interrupted, "the constant pretense, the feeling that I'm slowly disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be. I can't give you what Arthur Dennison can. No mansion, no social position, no financial security. Can you give me honesty, respect, the chance to be myself instead of an ornament for someone else's ambitions? You know I can. Then you can give me everything that matters." He kissed her then, soft and desperate, and Josephine felt something inside, her chest break open not with pain, but with relief. This was what she had been missing, what all those proper suitors and strategic arrangements had failed to provide. This sense of coming home to herself, of being seen and valued for who she truly was. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This is madness," Eli said, though his hands remained gentle on her face. "Perhaps, but it's the first thing that's felt real in years." They spent the rest of the day completing the survey work, but with a new awareness crackling between them. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment of cooperation felt charged with possibility. When Eli helped her over rough terrain, his hands lingered. When she leaned close to read his compass, she felt his breath catch. That evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing another simple meal, the weight of unspoken decisions hung between them. "What happens when we go back?" Eli asked finally. "Arthur will be waiting. My father will demand explanations. I'll be expected to return to Boston immediately and proceed with wedding plans. And will you?" Josephine stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. "I don't know if I'm brave enough to fight them both." "What if you didn't have to fight alone?" She looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time I stopped hiding from life. Maybe it's time I took a chance on something good instead of protecting myself from loss." "Eli, you can't be serious. The scandal alone would..." "Would what? Ruin your reputation, cost you your father's approval." His voice was gentle but determined. "Josephine, what is your reputation worth if it's built on living someone else's life? What is approval worth if it means giving up your chance at happiness?" She thought about her conversation with him the night before, about courage and choosing her own path. Here was her test, not in some distant future, but right now. If I refuse Arthur, if I defy my father's plans, there's no going back. He'll disown me. I'll have nothing, no money, no position, no security. You'll have yourself, and if you want it, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet box again. You'll have me. Josephine stared at the box, her heart pounding. Everything rational in her mind screamed warnings about social ruin, financial hardship, the impossibility of bridging their different worlds. But everything in her heart whispered a different truth. Are you proposing to me, Eli Thornfield? I'm asking if you'd consider choosing love over obligation. I'm asking if you think what we've found together is worth fighting for. As she looked into his storm-grey eyes, seeing hope and fear and desperate longing reflected there, Josephine realized that all her life she had been waiting for someone to give her permission to be herself. But permission wasn't something that could be given, it was something that had to be taken. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it's worth fighting for." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like coming home. They returned to Eli's cabin on the third day to find 3 horses tied outside and the unmistakable signs of unwelcome visitors. Josephine felt her stomach drop as she recognized the expensive tack and polished leather that spoke of wealth and urban sophistication. "Looks like your father's man found you," Eli said quietly, "and brought company." Josephine's voice was tight with apprehension. They dismounted slowly, and Josephine unconsciously moved Eli's ring from her left hand to her right, hiding it beneath her glove. Whatever confrontation awaited them inside, she needed time to think, to plan, to prepare her arguments. The cabin door opened before they reached it, and Arthur Dennison stepped onto the porch with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to controlling situations. He was exactly as Josephine remembered, tall, well-dressed, conventionally handsome in the way that came from good breeding and careful grooming. Behind him emerged 2 other men, her father's lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, and someone she didn't recognize but who had the look of hired muscle. "Josephine," Arthur said, his voice carrying relief and reproof in equal measure, "thank God you're safe. When your father received no word from you, we feared the worst. As you can see, I'm perfectly well." She kept her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Though I'm surprised by this delegation. Surely 1 telegram would have sufficed to confirm my welfare." "1 telegram?" Arthur's eyebrows rose in practiced dismay. "My dear, you've been missing for a week with no word except vague mentions of an accident. Your reputation, our engagement, is perfectly intact, as anyone can see." Arthur's gaze shifted to Eli, who had remained silent beside her, and his expression hardened. "I'm afraid I can't agree. The mere fact that you've been staying here unchaperoned with this gentleman has already caused considerable talk." "This gentleman," Josephine said with ice in her voice, "saved my life when I was injured and stranded. He has shown me nothing but kindness and respect." "I'm sure he has." Arthur's tone suggested he doubted that very much. "Nevertheless, the situation is untenable. I've come to escort you back to Boston immediately, where we can begin damage control and proceed with our wedding plans." "Wedding plans that I've never agreed to." Arthur exchanged a meaningful look with the lawyer before responding. "Josephine, I understand this rustic adventure has been unsettling, but you're overwrought. Once you're back in familiar surroundings, you'll see things more clearly." "I see things quite clearly now, thank you." Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, producing a sheaf of legal documents. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps we should discuss this inside, away from distractions." Eli spoke for the first time. "Any discussion concerning Miss Whitmore's welfare is welcome to take place right here." Arthur's mask of polite concern slipped slightly. "I don't believe this concerns you, Mr. Thornfield, Eli Thornfield. And anything concerning Miss Whitmore's welfare concerns me very much." "How presumptuous!" Arthur's voice carried a subtle threat. "Perhaps you're unaware of Miss Whitmore's position in society, her family's influence, the damage that could come to a simple rancher who overestimates his importance." Josephine felt Eli tense beside her, but his voice remained level. "Perhaps you're unaware that threats don't impress me much." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "Gentlemen, surely we can resolve this amicably. Miss Whitmore, your father has authorized me to handle certain irregularities that may have arisen during your extended absence. However, there are some documents that require your immediate attention." He handed her a thick envelope marked with her father's business seal. As Josephine opened it, she was dimly aware of Arthur directing the 3rd man to begin loading her belongings from the cabin. The first document was a letter from her father, written in his precise hand and containing exactly the fury and disappointment she had expected. But it was the second document that made her blood run cold, a preliminary investigation into Eli's background and property ownership, clearly conducted by her father's business investigators. The third document made her sink onto the porch steps in shock. "What is it?" Eli asked, noting her pallor. With trembling hands, she held up what appeared to be a mineral rights assessment and property evaluation. According to the official documents, Eli's land contained significant silver deposits, enough to make him one of the wealthiest men in Texas if properly developed. More shocking still, the mineral rights had been legally transferred to him when he purchased the property, though he had apparently been unaware of their existence or value. "I don't understand," she whispered. Arthur moved to read over her shoulder, and she saw his expression change from condescension to calculation. Well, it appears our rustic friend is not quite what he seems." Eli took the documents from her nerveless fingers, scanning them with growing bewilderment. "This can't be right." "Oh, it's quite accurate," Mr. Blackwood assured him. "Mr. Whitmore's geological surveys are very thorough. Those mineral rights make you worth approximately," he consulted his notes, $2 million, conservatively. The silence that followed was deafening. Josephine stared at Eli, seeing her own shock reflected in his face. $2 million. More money than most people could imagine, certainly enough to elevate him to her social level and beyond. "You knew." Arthur's voice cut through her confusion like a blade. "I beg your pardon. You knew about the mineral rights. This entire charade, the accident, the extended stay, the convenient romance, it's all been carefully orchestrated." Arthur's accusations came fast and furious. "Your father suspected as much when you delayed your return. That's why he ordered the investigation." "That's not true, isn't it? How convenient that Charles Whitmore's daughter just happened to be injured on the property of the one man in the territory who could match her family's wealth. How fortuitous that you developed such strong feelings for someone who could offer you both love and financial security." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. "I had no idea." "Of course you did." Arthur turned to Eli with a sneer. "And you, Mr. Thornfield, or should I say, the mysterious millionaire hermit, I suppose you're equally shocked by this revelation." Eli's face had gone stone cold. "I never knew about any mineral rights." "Naturally. Just as you never knew that Miss Whitmore's survey work was specifically designed to identify valuable properties for her father's acquisition. What an amazing coincidence that you two found each other." "Stop it," Josephine said desperately. "You're twisting everything." "Am I? Tell me, Miss Whitmore, when exactly did your feelings for Mr. Thornfield develop? Before or after you realized his potential value to your family's business interests?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. Josephine looked at Eli and saw something terrible happening in his expression. Doubt creeping in, old wounds reopening, the walls she had watched him slowly lower, beginning to rebuild themselves. "Eli, you can't believe—" "Can't I?" His voice was flat, emotionless. "You came here to survey land for your father's railroad. You stayed longer than planned, developed convenient feelings for the property owner, and now we discover that property is worth a fortune." He looked at the documents again. "Quite a coincidence." "It is a coincidence. I swear to you, I knew nothing about mineral rights or silver deposits." "But you knew your father sent investigators. You knew he was having my background checked." Eli's eyes were cold now, distant. "How long have you known, Josephine?" "I didn't know. These documents are the first I've seen." "The first you've seen today, perhaps, but your father's seal suggests they've been in preparation for some time." Arthur stepped closer to Josephine, his voice falsely gentle. "My dear, surely you can see how this looks. A wealthy heiress, a strategic survey mission, a convenient accident leading to an extended stay with a suddenly valuable property owner. Your father is a businessman. He'll naturally assume this was planned." "Because you're making him assume it." Josephine turned frantically to Eli. "You know me. You know what we've shared these past days was real. Do I? His voice was like winter. You're Charles Whitmore's daughter, raised in a world of business transactions and strategic alliances. Why should I believe your feelings for me aren't just as calculated as everything else in your life? The pain in his words cut deeper than any physical injury. Because you know me, I know what you've shown me. But apparently, there's quite a lot you haven't shown me. Arthur placed a possessive hand on Josephine's shoulder. Come, my dear, we have a long journey back to Boston, and your father is anxious to discuss these developments with you. I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. Oh, it's resolved, Eli said, his voice carrying a finality that made her heart break. You have what you came for. A complete survey of valuable property and a detailed assessment of its mineral wealth. Mission accomplished. That's not what I came for, isn't it? He stepped back from her, and she felt the distance like a chasm opening between them. You'd better go, Miss Whitmore. Your real life is waiting. As Arthur's hired man finished loading her belongings into the wagon, Josephine made one last, desperate attempt to reach the man she had fallen in love with. Eli, please, what we found, together, what we felt, that was real. Don't let them destroy it with suspicion and lies. For a moment, she thought she saw the real Eli looking back at her, the gentle, wounded man who had opened his heart despite his fears. Then the mask slammed back into place. Real or not, it doesn't matter now. You belong in your world, and I belong in mine. The mineral rights don't change, that they just make the truth clearer. As the wagon pulled away from the cabin, Josephine looked back to see Eli standing alone on his porch. The documents scattered at his feet like the ruins of everything they had built together. The twisted horseshoe that had started it all still hung over his door, but now it seemed less like a symbol of fate and more like a cruel reminder of what might have been. She had found love, only to lose it to the very wealth and position she had been trying to escape. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The journey back to Bitter Creek passed in a blur of dust and misery. Josephine sat rigid in the wagon beside Arthur, her hands clenched in her lap, Eli's ring hidden beneath her glove like a secret that burned against her skin. Every mile that passed between her and the cabin felt like another nail in the coffin of the life she had briefly imagined possible. Arthur maintained a stream of polite conversation plans for their return to Boston, guest lists for their wedding, business opportunities that would arise from her father's new land acquisitions. His words washed over her like background noise, meaningless chatter that had nothing to do with the woman she had become during those precious days in the valley. "You're very quiet, my dear," Arthur observed as they reached the outskirts of town. "I hope you're not still upset about this unfortunate misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Josephine's voice was sharp enough to make him flinch. "This business with the rancher, surely you can see how it appeared to your father and to me. A strategic romance with a suddenly wealthy property owner." Arthur's tone was indulgent, as if he were speaking to a child who had been caught in a minor misbehavior. It wasn't strategic, it was real. Real feelings, perhaps, but hardly practical ones. You must see that a permanent alliance would be impossible. The man may have mineral wealth, but he lacks breeding, education, social connections, all the things that matter in our world. Our world? Josephine looked at him with new clarity. You mean your world? The world where people are valued for their utility rather than their character. Arthur's patience was beginning to fray. Don't be naive, Josephine. Character is a luxury for those who can afford it. In business, in life, pragmatism serves better than sentiment. As they pulled up to the hotel, Josephine saw that word of their arrival had already spread. Townspeople gathered on the boardwalk, their faces showing various combinations of curiosity, sympathy, and scandalous interest. Mrs. Patterson from the general store caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod, while others whispered behind their hands. In her hotel room, Josephine found a stack of telegrams waiting, all from her father, each more demanding than the last. The final one, sent just that morning, made her stomach clench with dread. Returning Boston immediately. Stop. Wedding moved to next month. Stop. Scandal must be contained. Stop. Dennison has full authority. Stop. Father. Next month. 4 weeks to prepare for a marriage she had never wanted to a man she would never love. 4 weeks before her brief taste of freedom and authentic feeling became nothing more than a memory she would carry for the rest of her life. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Arthur entered without waiting for permission, followed by Mr. Blackwood, carrying his briefcase of legal documents. "We need to discuss practical matters," Arthur announced, settling into the room's single chair with the air of a man taking possession. "Your father has made certain decisions about how to proceed, and there are documents requiring your signature." Mr. Blackwood opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "First, the formal statement regarding your time with Mr. Thornfield. For legal purposes and to protect against future claims, we need your sworn testimony that no impropriety occurred." Josephine stared at the document. It was carefully worded to make her relationship with Eli sound like nothing more than proper assistance during a medical emergency. Every moment of growing understanding, every shared laugh, every gentle touch was reduced to cold legal language that drained all meaning from what they had experienced together. "This isn't what happened," she said quietly. "It's what needs to have happened," Arthur corrected, "for your reputation and for our family's business interests. And if I refuse to sign..." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your father has been quite clear about the consequences of non-cooperation. The scandal would affect not just your own prospects, but the entire Whitmore business empire. Thousands of employees, dozens of business partnerships, all potentially damaged by one young woman's romantic notions." The weight of guilt settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her choices would affect innocent people who depended on her father's business for their livelihoods. "There's also this," Arthur added, producing another document. "A marriage contract with very specific terms regarding your behavior, your public appearances, and your role in family business matters. Your father wants no ambiguity about expectations going forward." Josephine scanned the contract with growing horror. It was less a marriage agreement than a business arrangement, specifying everything from where they would live to how many social events she would be required to attend each month. There was even a clause about children, their number, timing, and education, all predetermined by her father's strategic vision. "This is barbaric," she whispered. "This is security," Arthur corrected. "You'll want for nothing, have access to the finest society, travel to Europe when appropriate. Many women would envy such a position. Many women would prefer to choose their own husbands. Choice is overrated. Compatibility, shared interests, mutual respect, these develop over time. Passion fades, but practical partnerships endure." As Josephine stared at the contracts that would define the rest of her life, she thought about Eli alone in his cabin, probably preparing to sell his property and disappear again. The mineral wealth that could have solved all their practical problems had instead become the weapon that destroyed their chance at happiness. "I need time to consider these documents," she said finally. "Time is exactly what we don't have," Arthur replied. "The morning train leaves for San Antonio, where we'll connect to the eastbound line. Your father expects us in Boston within the week. Then he'll be disappointed." Arthur's facade of patience finally cracked. "Josephine, you will sign these documents and board that train, or your father will take steps to ensure your compliance. He has the legal right to commit you to a private sanitarium for observation if he deems you mentally unstable." The threat hung in the air like a sword. Josephine had heard whispers of such things: inconvenient, daughters declared hysterical, and locked away until they became more manageable. It was perfectly legal and socially acceptable, a way for powerful men to deal with women who refused to conform. "You would actually do that?" "Your father would do that," Arthur corrected. "I would prefer to avoid such unpleasantness, but the choice is yours." After they left her alone to consider her options, Josephine sat by the window, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. Somewhere out there, Eli was probably packing his belongings, preparing to run from pain once again. She had brought nothing but heartbreak into his carefully protected world. But as the darkness deepened, a different kind of resolve began building in her chest. She thought about little Katie Morrison, who had seen magic in everyday things and asked 1,000 questions about the world around her. She thought about Rachel and Benjamin, who had died pursuing their dreams of a better life in the West. She thought about the woman she had been becoming in those precious days at the cabin, authentic, capable, genuinely alive for the first time in her adult life. Was that woman worth fighting for? Was the love she had found with Eli worth risking everything she had been raised to value? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Patterson standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Miss Whitmore, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you before." The older woman glanced nervously down the hallway. "Before you leave town, please come in." Mrs. Patterson entered and closed the door carefully behind her. "I've lived in Bitter Creek for 20 years, and I've never seen Eli Thornfield look at anyone the way he looked at you when you rode through town together." Josephine felt tears threatening. "I'm afraid that's over now." "Is it? Or are you just letting other people convince you it has to be?" "Mrs. Patterson, you don't understand the complications. I understand that life is short and love is precious, and both are wasted when we let fear make our decisions for us." The older woman's voice was gentle but firm. "I also understand that the morning train doesn't leave until 10 o'clock, and a lot can happen between now and then. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time someone in this town stood up for what's right instead of what's convenient." Mrs. Patterson moved to the window and pointed toward the distant hills. "Eli Thornfield is a good man who's been carrying grief and guilt for too long. You brought light back into his eyes, child. Don't let them snuff it out because it doesn't fit their plans." After Mrs. Patterson left, Josephine spent the longest night of her life wrestling with an impossible decision. She could sign the contracts, board the train, and return to a life of comfortable constraint. She could marry Arthur Dennison and spend her days hosting dinner parties and managing household staff, while her heart slowly died from neglect. Or she could choose courage over security, love over obligation, authenticity over approval. As dawn approached, she made her choice. Moving quietly so as not to wake Arthur or Mr. Blackwood in the adjoining rooms, Josephine gathered her few personal belongings and the engagement ring that had started this whole mess. She left everything else, the expensive dresses, the jewelry, the symbols of her privileged position behind. In their place, she took only the clothes Mrs. Patterson had selected for her, her surveying equipment, and the small amount of money she had brought for expenses. It wasn't much to start a new life with, but it would have to be enough. The pre-dawn streets of Bitter Creek were empty, except for a few early risers preparing for the day's work. As Josephine made her way to the livery stable, she felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. She was about to burn every bridge that led back to her old life, and she had no guarantee that the man she loved would even want to see her again. But she was finally, truly free to find out. The stable-keeper, Pete, looked surprised to see her so early. "Miss Whitmore, thought you were leaving on the morning train. Change of plans," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to borrow a horse." Pete studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical clothes and determined expression. "This wouldn't have anything to do with young Thornfield, would it?" "It might." A slow smile spread across the old man's face. "Well, it's about time someone showed some sense around here. Rosie's already saddled. I had a feeling you might be needing her this morning." As Josephine rode out of town toward Eli's Valley, the sunrise painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. Behind her, she could hear the distant whistle of the approaching train that was supposed to carry her back to Boston. Ahead lay uncertainty, the possibility of rejection, and the man who had shown her what it meant to truly live. For the first time in her life, she was riding toward her own choice rather than away from someone else's expectations. Whatever happened next, she would face it as the woman she had chosen to become, rather than the one she had been trained to be. Josephine found Eli in his barn, methodically packing his belongings into worn saddlebags. The sight of him preparing to leave sent panic racing through her veins, but it was the wedding dress draped over a nearby stall that made her heart stop entirely. The dress was torn and mud-stained, clearly damaged beyond repair. It lay there like a discarded skin, and she realized with crystal clarity what it represented: the life she had cast off, the woman she refused to be any longer. "Going somewhere?" she asked, dismounting carefully. Eli looked up, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before the careful mask slammed back into place. "Thought you'd be on the train to Boston by now." "I was supposed to be." She moved closer, noting the way he tensed as she approached. "I chose differently." "Brave choice, considering your father's threats." "How did you—" She stopped, realizing it didn't matter how he knew. "Eli, we need to talk." Nothing left to say. He returned to his packing with determined focus. "You got what you came for: complete survey of the property, mineral rights documentation, full assessment of its value. Your father should be pleased." "I didn't come here for any of that." "Didn't you?" He finally looked at her directly, and she saw pain and betrayal warring in his storm-grey eyes. Convenient accident, extended recovery time, strategic romance with the newly wealthy property owner. Sounds like a perfect business plan to me. The accusation stung because she understood how it looked from his perspective. Everything about their meeting and subsequent relationship could be interpreted as calculated manipulation, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. "You think I orchestrated meeting you? That I deliberately injured myself to create an opportunity for seduction? I think you're Charles Whitmore's daughter, raised to see every relationship as a potential business transaction." Josephine felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "Then you don't know me at all." "Maybe I don't. Maybe I only know what you wanted me to see." The words hit like physical blows, but they also sparked something fierce in her chest: anger at his willingness to believe the worst, at his readiness to throw away what they had built together. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp with pain and determination. "If you want to believe I'm nothing more than a scheming fortune hunter, then believe it. But before you run away again, I want you to see exactly what I sacrificed for this supposed business arrangement." She reached into her bag and pulled out the torn wedding dress, holding it up between them like evidence in a trial. "This is what I was wearing when I fled my own wedding this morning." Arthur had planned a surprise ceremony, small, private, designed to contain the scandal of my extended absence. The minister was waiting, the papers were signed, and all I had to do was walk down the aisle and become Mrs. Arthur Dennison. Eli's hands stilled on his packing, his attention fully focused on her now. "Instead, I tore this dress climbing out a window, ruined these shoes running through back alleys, and spent my last $20 on a horse to ride out here and tell you that I love you." Her voice was shaking now, but she pressed on. "If this was all a business arrangement, Eli, then I'm the worst businesswoman in history, because I just gave up everything: my inheritance, my social position, my family's approval, for a man who thinks so little of me that he believes I could fake what we shared." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of hurt and mistrust on his side, desperation and heartbreak on hers. "Josephine, I'm not finished." She moved closer, close enough to see the conflict in his expression. "You want to know what convinced me you were worth fighting for? It wasn't the mineral rights or the money or any practical consideration. It was watching you with your horses, seeing the gentleness in your hands when you wrapped my ankle, listening to you talk about Katie Morrison with such love that it broke your voice." She reached up to touch his face, and he didn't pull away. "It was realizing that for the first time in my life, someone saw me, really saw me, not as Charles Whitmore's daughter or a potential business asset, but as myself." It was discovering what it felt like to be loved for who I am rather than what I represent. The money changes things. The money changes nothing. She pulled off her glove and showed him the ring he had given her, still on her finger despite everything. I was wearing this when I climbed out that window. I was wearing it when I chose you over security, love over obligation, authenticity over approval. Eli stared at the ring, and she saw the exact moment when his walls began to crumble. You left your wedding for me. I left my wedding for us, for the life we could build together if you're brave enough to trust what we found in that valley. Josephine, His voice broke, and suddenly his arms were around her, holding her against his chest like he was afraid she might disappear. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. When I saw those documents, when Arthur made his accusations, all I could think about was how I'd been fooled before by people who wanted something from me. I don't want anything from you except what you've already given me the chance to be myself. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I love you so much it terrifies me. Then stop running from it. Stop running from us. When he kissed her, it tasted like hope and promises and new beginnings. But even as she melted into his embrace, Josephine knew their troubles were far from over. Her father would not accept her defiance quietly, and Arthur would not give up his claim without a fight. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. They broke apart to see a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving fast toward the cabin. Company, Eli said grimly. Josephine's heart sank as she recognized the purposeful pace of the riders. My father's men. They'll have discovered I'm missing by now. Then we'd better be ready for them. The riders who thundered into the yard were led by Arthur Dennison, his face dark with fury and humiliation. Behind him rode Mr. Blackwood, the hired muscle from the day before, and surprisingly, Sheriff Morrison, a man Josephine recognized as Tom Morrison's brother, Katie's uncle. Josephine, Arthur dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his composure completely shattered. This madness ends now. You will return with me immediately. I'm exactly where I choose to be, Josephine replied, moving to stand beside Eli. Choose? Arthur's laugh was bitter. You're hysterical, clearly unfit to make rational decisions. Sheriff Morrison has legal authority to detain you for your own protection. The sheriff, a weathered man in his 50s, looked uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. Miss Whitmore, your father's telegram says you've been influenced by this man, claims he's holding you against your will. That's not true, Sheriff. I came here of my own free will, and I'm staying of my own free will. She's been compromised, Arthur insisted. Seduced by the promise of mineral wealth, manipulated by a man who clearly targeted her for financial gain. That's enough. Eli's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried across the yard like thunder. You can question Miss Whitmore's decisions, but you will not question her character or intelligence. Arthur turned on him with vicious satisfaction. How noble. Tell me, Mr. Thornfield, when exactly did you discover the mineral rights to your property? Before or after you decided to romance Charles Whitmore's daughter? I learned about the mineral rights yesterday, same as you. Convenient timing. And I suppose the proposal was equally spontaneous? Josephine saw Eli's hands clench into fists, but before he could respond, Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with an unexpected intervention. Arthur, that's enough. I've known Eli Thornfield for 5 years, and he's never shown interest in anything but his horses and his privacy. If Miss Whitmore says she's here by choice, then that's good enough for me. Sheriff Morrison, Mr. Blackwood interjected smoothly, perhaps you're not aware of the legal complexities involved. Miss Whitmore is engaged to Mr. Dennison, with contracts signed by her father. Her current behavior could be considered breach of contract, with significant financial implications. Could be, the sheriff agreed. But last I checked, we don't enforce arranged marriages in Texas. If the lady wants to break her engagement, that's between her and her conscience. Arthur's face flushed with rage. This is intolerable. Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for kidnapping, fraud, and alienation of affections. On what evidence? The evidence is obvious. He's clearly manipulated a vulnerable woman for financial gain. The only person trying to manipulate me, Josephine interrupted, is standing right there. She pointed directly at Arthur. You've threatened me with commitment to an asylum, tried to force me into signing contracts I never agreed to, and now you're attempting to have an innocent man arrested because I chose him over you. Innocent? Arthur's voice cracked with frustration. He's stolen my fiancée. I was never your fiancée. My father may have announced an engagement, but I never consented to it. Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly. Miss, are you saying you're here willingly, not under any coercion or false promises? I'm saying I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with. And you, Eli, you got anything to say about these accusations? Eli looked at Josephine, then back at the assembled men. I love her, Sheriff. Not her money, not her family connections, not any advantage she might bring me. Just her. And if she'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that every day. Well then, Sheriff Morrison touched his hat brim. Sounds like we're done here. We are not done, Arthur exploded. I have legal documents, which Miss Whitmore clearly doesn't want to honor, and since she's of legal age and sound mind, that's her right. Her father will have you removed from office. Her father's in Boston, and this is Texas. We tend to take a dim view of Eastern businessmen trying to tell us how to handle our affairs. As the confrontation escalated, Josephine noticed something that made her heart swell with unexpected emotion. Other riders were approaching townspeople from Bitter Creek, led by Mrs. Patterson and her husband. Pete, from the livery stable, the hotel proprietor, even some of the cowboys who had whispered about her arrival. What's this about? Arthur demanded, as the group assembled. Mrs. Patterson urged her horse forward, carrying what appeared to be a document. It's a petition, signed by every resident of Bitter Creek who witnessed Miss Whitmore and Mr. Thornfield together these past weeks. She handed the paper to Sheriff Morrison, who scanned it with growing interest. Says here that the signers observed Miss Whitmore acting of her own free will, showing no signs of coercion or manipulation. Says Mr. Thornfield treated her with respect and kindness throughout her stay. The sheriff looked up with the hint of a smile. Also says they'd be proud to have both of them as permanent residents of their community. Josephine felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at the faces of people who had accepted her not as Charles Whitmore's daughter, but simply as herself. This is preposterous, Arthur sputtered. A handful of frontier nobodies cannot override. Can't they? Sheriff Morrison's voice was deceptively mild. Seems to me the good people of Bitter Creek know their neighbors pretty well, and they've made their position clear. Arthur looked around the assembled group, his confidence finally wavering as he realized he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. This isn't over. Charles Whitmore will not accept this humiliation quietly. Then Charles Whitmore is welcome to come to Texas and discuss the matter in person, the sheriff replied. Until then, I suggest you gentlemen head back to town and catch the next train east. As Arthur and his companions rode away in defeat, the townspeople gathered around Josephine and Eli with warm congratulations and genuine affection. For the first time in her life, Josephine felt like she belonged to a community that valued her for herself rather than her connections. Thank you, she whispered to Mrs. Patterson. All of you. Thank you for standing up for us. Honey, the older woman smiled. We've been waiting years for someone to make that stubborn man smile again. And you brought light back to his eyes. That's worth fighting for. As the crowd dispersed and they were finally alone, Eli pulled Josephine into his arms. Are you sure about this? He asked. Your father won't give up easily, and life here won't be anything like what you're used to. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she replied. I choose you, Eli Thornfield. I choose us. I choose this life, this love, this chance to build something real together. When he kissed her, the twisted horseshoe over his door seemed to catch the sunlight, gleaming like a promise of luck finally turning in their favor. 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning that painted the Texas hills in shades of green and gold, Josephine Whitmore became Josephine Thornfield in the small wooden church of Bitter Creek. She wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, and carried wild flowers that Eli had picked from their own meadow at sunrise. The ceremony was nothing like the elaborate society wedding she had attended in Boston. There were no orchestras or imported flowers, no photographers or columns in society papers. Instead, there were genuine friends, heartfelt vows, and the kind of joy that came from choosing love over convenience. Sheriff Morrison walked her down the aisle in the absence of her father, who had maintained his furious silence since her telegram announcing her engagement to a horse rancher of good character and modest means. She had not mentioned the mineral rights in her letter, and Eli had quietly arranged for the silver deposits to remain undeveloped for now. They had agreed that their love needed to be tested by ordinary challenges before they faced the complications that extraordinary wealth might bring. As she spoke her vows, looking into Eli's storm-grey eyes that now held nothing but love and trust, Josephine reflected on the woman she had been just months before. That carefully controlled creature in silk dresses and pearl jewelry seemed like a stranger now, someone she had played rather than someone she had been. The woman who stood in the small church, her hands calloused from honest work and her face tanned by the Texas sun, was more authentically herself than she had ever been. She could gentle a skittish horse, survey land with professional precision, and hold her own in the practical challenges of ranch life. More importantly, she had learned to value her own worth independent of others' approval. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. There was fiddle music and dancing, stories and laughter, and the kind of community warmth that Josephine had never experienced in her previous life. As she danced with her new husband under the stars, she felt the completeness that came from being exactly where she belonged. "Any regrets?" Eli asked as they swayed to the music. "Only that it took me so long to find the courage to choose this life." "Worth the wait," he murmured against her ear. "All of it." Their first year of marriage brought challenges that tested their commitment in ways neither had anticipated. Learning to merge two very different backgrounds required patience, compromise, and frequent conversations about expectations and dreams. Josephine had to adapt to physical work and financial uncertainty, while Eli had to adjust to having a partner who brought her own opinions and capabilities to their shared life. But they had also discovered joys neither had expected. Josephine found deep satisfaction in the tangible results of ranch work, healthy horses, productive land, a home built with their own hands. Eli rediscovered his capacity for trust and openness, sharing not just his bed, but his deepest thoughts and fears with the woman who had proven her love through sacrifice. The mineral rights remained their secret through that first year, a safety net they chose not to access while they built their foundation on more fundamental values. When they finally decided to develop a small portion of the silver deposits, it was with careful planning and community consideration, creating jobs for local people and ensuring that prosperity enhanced rather than corrupted their simple life. The success of their mining operation brought unexpected challenges, including a grudging reconciliation with Josephine's father. Charles Whitmore's initial fury had gradually given way to business pragmatism as reports of his daughter's newfound wealth reached Boston. His first letter in 18 months was stiffly formal but represented the beginning of a relationship that would slowly heal over time. "He wants to visit," Josephine announced one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "How do you feel about that?" Eli asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Nervous, hopeful, ready to show him the woman I've become and the life we've built." When Charles Whitmore finally visited Texas, he found a daughter transformed. The nervous, people-pleasing young woman he had attempted to control had become a confident, capable partner in a thriving enterprise. More importantly, she was genuinely happy, something that had been notably absent from her previous life of privilege and obligation. "You've changed," he observed during their first awkward conversation. "I've grown up," she replied. "I've learned to value myself based on what I contribute rather than what I inherit." The reconciliation was gradual and imperfect, but it represented progress toward a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Charles Whitmore would never fully understand his daughter's choices, but he couldn't argue with their results. As their second anniversary approached, Josephine and Eli established new traditions that honored both their past struggles and their present contentment. They kept a shared journal, no longer Eli's solitary record of horses and weather, but a collaborative chronicle of their life together. The pages documented everything from business decisions to personal milestones, from funny conversations to profound realizations about love and partnership. "Look at this," Josephine said one evening, reading from an early entry. "You wrote, 'Jay asked about breeding program for spring foals. Her questions show real understanding of bloodlines and temperament. I had no idea you were taking notes on my progress.' I was documenting evidence," Eli replied with a grin. "Proof that Charles Whitmore's daughter could become a real rancher. And what's the verdict?" He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Verdict is that she became something even better herself." On quiet evenings, they would often return to the high pasture where they had first admitted their love for each other. The view remained as spectacular as ever, but now it represented not just beauty, but home, a place where they had chosen to build their future together. The twisted horseshoe still hung over their door, now polished and decorated with ribbons from their wedding. It had become a symbol not of accident or coincidence, but of the way life could surprise you with exactly what you needed when you were brave enough to accept it. As Josephine lay in her husband's arms on the anniversary of their first meeting, she thought about the injured ankle that had changed everything. Such a small thing, a moment of pain that had led to a lifetime of joy. She had come to Bitter Creek seeking to prove her worth to her father, but instead had discovered her worth to herself. The woman who had once been afraid to disappoint others now knew the deeper fear of disappointing herself. The woman who had once performed for approval now understood the difference between being seen and being valued. The woman who had once measured her life by others' expectations now created her own definition of success. In the end, the giant cowboy had indeed carried the rich woman with the twisted ankle. But what he had really carried was her heart, her hopes, and her courage to become the woman she was always meant to be. And what she had given him in return was the faith to love again, the trust to build again, and the joy of sharing a life with someone who chose him not for what he could provide, but for who he truly was. Some love stories begin with passion and fade with familiarity. Theirs had begun with recognition and deepened with time, proving that the best foundations for lasting happiness are built not on grand gestures, but on daily choices to honor, support, and cherish the person you've chosen to love. The twisted ankle had healed long ago, but the love it had made possible would last forever.